The porch light was off. Ottilie Marchbanks moved by moon alone, barefoot in the wet grass behind the smokehouse. 71 years old, spine bent like a fishhook, and still she knelt in the dirt at midnight. Her hands found the buried coffee can without looking. 30 years of practice does that to a body. She pried the lid. Inside, 12 small jars, each wrapped in a scrap of flour sack, each labeled in pencil gone soft with age. She lifted one, held it to the moon, and pressed it to her chest like a sleeping child. Across the fence line, Cassius Bulai watched from his truck window, engine idling, headlights off. He'd seen her do this before, spring and fall, like clockwork, for as long as he'd lived next door. Never once explained. Never once let anybody near that can. Folks in Sourwood Gap had a name for it, Ottie's foolishness. But Cass noticed something that night he hadn't before. She wasn't just checking the jars, she was counting them. And her hands, he'd swear on his mother's grave, were shaking, not from cold and not from age, from something closer to fear. If you're the kind of soul who slows down for a story like this one, go on and hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it means the world. And drop a comment telling me what town you're watching from tonight. I read everyone, and I like knowing whose porch light is on with mine. Sourwood Gap sits in a fold of Letcher County, Kentucky, where the ridge is close and so tight the sun doesn't clear the tree line till 9 and slips behind it again by 5. Coal money had come and gone twice in that valley, leaving behind empty tipples and families who farmed the creek bottoms because there wasn't much else left to do. The Marchbanks place was 41 acres of steep, stubborn ground, worked by Ottilie and her husband Emery since the year Eisenhower left office. By the season this story turns on, Emery's lungs had gone bad from a lifetime of dust, and it was Ottilie who rose first and worked longest. The family held the land on a contract for deed, signed in better years with a local man named Pernell Hackaday, who'd inherited both the paper and his father's patience for collecting on it. The contract called for one final balloon payment due the first frost after 30 years, a sum that had felt distant in 1975 and now, with that season's harvest, sat close enough to touch. Miss it, and the acreage reverted to Hackaday clean, no court needed. Everyone in the valley knew the date. Everyone also knew the Marchbanks tobacco allotment had shrunk twice in a decade, and that this might be the year the numbers simply didn't add up. Ottilie's granddaughter, June, was 12 that year and kept a private ledger of her own, not money, but worry, tallied each night in a spiral notebook under her pillow. She remembered the smell of her grandmother's kitchen better than almost anything. Coffee grounds drying on newspaper by the stove, saved and reused as garden mulch, nothing in that house ever thrown away twice. June once asked why Grandma Ottie kept old jars instead of buying new hybrid seed like the co-op sold, seed that came in bright paper packets with photographs of perfect fruit. Ottilie only said, "Pictures don't feed a family child, roots do." June wrote that down too. The ridicule came easy in a place where everybody's business sat in plain view. At the Sourwood Gap Co-op, the county extension agent, a brisk, well-meaning man named Talmadge Ott, had twice offered Ottilie certified hybrid seed at cost, and twice she declined, polite as church. "Mrs. Marchbanks insists on planting museum pieces," he told the co-op counter one Saturday, loud enough to carry, "while the rest of the county tries to make a living." Men chuckled into their coffee. Cass Bulai, who farmed the next ridge over and had known Ottilie since they were both children fishing the same creek, didn't laugh, but he didn't defend her either. Not yet. What none of them accounted for was the second trouble already moving up the valley that spring. A trouble with no interest in mortgages or gossip, one that would arrive on the wind itself, in spores too small to see, and would not care one bit whose seed came from a bright paper packet, and whose came from a coffee can buried behind a smokehouse for 30 patient years. It started, as these things do, with a single dead plant. In late June, Cass Bulai found a blighted tomato vine at the edge of his lower field, leaves curling black at the tips, stems weeping a rust-colored ooze. By the 4th of July, it had crossed the fence into 3 more farms. Talmadge Ott drove out from the extension office with a soil sample kit and a face gone pale. He confirmed it within the week. A late blight strain, aggressive and fast-moving, the kind that had wiped out whole seasons in other counties before anyone could spray a countermeasure that worked. The state agriculture department issued a quarantine order within days. Every seed stock in the affected zone, stored, saved, or planted, was to be inspected by county agents and either certified disease-free or destroyed by burn barrel, no exceptions, deadline 10 days out. The order named specific townships. Sourwood Gap was one of them. For most farmers, this meant handing over what remained of last year's hybrid seed corn, already half compromised, and buying fresh certified stock from the co-op at a price that stung. For Ottilie Marchbanks, it meant something else entirely. It meant 12 jars in a coffee can were now, by law, subject to seizure. She told no one what those jars actually held. Not Cass, not Talmadge Ott, not even Emery in the early years, though he'd long since guessed. What she'd been doing every spring and fall for 3 decades was saving seed, not from the bright packets, but from the strongest, hardiest plants in her own garden each year, generation folded into generation, selected quietly for the traits that mattered on that particular ridge, in that particular soil, against that particular weather. Beans that shrugged off drought, corn that stood through wind, and tomatoes, a line she'd started from her own mother's garden, chosen year after year for the plants that simply refused to quit, blight or no blight, though she'd never once seen blight bad enough to prove it. "You ought to just let the man test it and be done," Cass told her one evening, leaning on her fence while she hoed a row by lantern light. "Ain't no shame in showing a jar of beans to Talmadge Ott." Ottilie kept hoeing. "He tests what he knows how to test," she said. "He don't know how to test 30 years. Cass shook his head, not unkindly. "Ottie, the man's got a badge from the state now. This ain't the co-op counter. He can make you burn what you don't show him." She straightened, wiped her palms on her apron, and said nothing at all, which worried him more than an argument would have. Ottilie planted anyway. While neighbors up and down the valley plowed under their blighted rows and waited on fresh certified seed from Frankfurt, she put her own saved stock into the ground, the very week the quarantine order came down, a defiance so plain that Pernell Hackaday himself drove out to ask if she understood what she was risking. "Mrs. Marchbanks," he said through his truck window, "that balloon payment comes due at first frost whether you've got a crop or not. I'd hate to see you plant something that gets you fined on top of foreclosed." Ottilie thanked him for his concern and asked after his mother's arthritis. He drove off unsatisfied. Then in late July the setback came. A hailstorm tore through the ridge in the night, flattening half of Ottilie's new plantings and pounding the rest into the mud. June found her grandmother the next morning standing in the wreckage of the bean rows, stalks snapped white at the base, not moving, not speaking. For the first time in the girl's memory, Ottilie looked old, truly old, the way a fence post looks old right before it gives. "Maybe Mr. Ott is right," June heard her murmur to no one. "Maybe I've kept dead men's seed too long to trust it against a live world." She sat that whole afternoon on the porch step, the coffee can lid resting in her lap, unopened. Emery, breathing hard through his oxygen line, made his way out to sit beside her, the longest walk he'd taken in a month. He didn't say much. He never did. But he laid his rough hand over hers on the lid and left it there until the shadows moved clear across the yard. That night, without a word to anyone, Ottilie went back out to the ruined rows with a lantern, a trowel, and what beans and corn kernels had survived the hail, and replanted every gap by hand before sunrise. The inspection deadline arrived on a gray Tuesday. Talmadge Ott's truck came slow up the gravel drive, county seal on the door, a leather satchel of sample bags on the seat beside him. Behind him, unbidden, came a second truck, Cass Bulies, and behind that 3 more from neighboring farms, drawn by the same rumor that had chased Ottilie for 30 years, that today, finally, the coffee can would open for good. Ottilie met them all in the yard, apron on, hands steady now. She didn't argue about the order. She simply led Talmadge Ott past the porch, past the smokehouse, toward the garden, where something had already begun to answer for her. Word had it later that Talmadge Ott stopped walking about 30 feet from the garden gate and simply stood there, satchel forgotten at his side, looking at rows of beans standing green and thick, where every other bean row in the township lay black and collapsed. But that sight and what came after it is a story for what happens next, once the gate swung open and the whole valley saw, for the first time, exactly what 30 years of coffee can patience had grown. The garden gate creaked open, and Talmadge Ott walked in first. What he found stopped him cold. Row after row of tomato vines stood upright and glossy-leaved, heavy with green fruit just beginning to blush. Beans climbed their poles thick and unblemished. Corn stood chest-high and clean, not a curled leaf among it, this on a morning when every hybrid field within 5 miles lay collapsed and rotting in the same wet heat. He crouched by a tomato stem, turned a leaf over in his fingers, checked the underside for the rust-colored weeping that had marked every other infected plant he'd tested that month. Nothing, not a trace. Caspioli came through the gate next, then the neighbors behind him, and one by one they went quiet in a way that felt almost like church. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Cass knelt beside a bean row himself, rubbed a leaf between thumb and finger, held it up to the light like he was checking a bank note for a watermark. "Ottie," he said finally, voice low, "how in the Lord's name?" She didn't answer with words. She reached into her apron pocket and set the 12 small jars, one by one, on the fence post, 30 seasons of saved seed, lined up in the morning sun for anyone to see. Talmadge Ott ran his own field test kit through 3 separate samples before he'd trust his own eyes, and each came back the same. No trace of the blight pathogen, not in the leaves, not in the soil around the roots. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He simply pulled a fresh certification tag from his satchel, wrote Ottilie Marchbanks' name across it in block letters, and staked it at the head of her garden row, the only certified blight-clear planting in the whole quarantine zone. By that afternoon, 3 neighboring farmers were standing in her yard with paper sacks, asking, for the first time in 30 years, if she might spare a little seed. By week's end, the county paper ran a photograph of the garden with Talmadge Ott's tag visible in the corner, and the extension office itself called to ask whether Ottilie would consider selling saved stock to farmers rebuilding after the blight. Pernell Hackaday drove out one more time, hat in hand, not to press about the balloon payment, but to ask sheepishly whether the Marchbanks garden might have enough surplus to cover it outright at harvest market price. It did, and then some. The coffee can that had drawn 30 years of quiet laughter became, in the space of one gray Tuesday, the only insurance policy in Letcher County that had never once needed renewing. That autumn, Ottilie sat on her porch step with Emery, both of them wrapped in the same quilt against the first real chill, watching June carry a fresh coffee can toward the smokehouse, her own, started that year with 3 jars instead of 12. "It's slow, what you taught me," June said, kneeling in the dirt the way she'd watched her grandmother kneel 100 times. Ottilie smiled, watching the girl's careful hands. "Slow things generally are the ones still standing at the end," she said. Down the ridge, the co-op's shelves that winter carried a new line of seed packets, plain paper, hand-labeled, no photographs at all, marked simply, Marchbanks stock. The land stayed in the family. The contract was paid in full that November, in cash counted out at Pernell Hackaday's kitchen table, mostly in small bills from farmers who'd bought seed by the sackful. Talmadge Ott still stops by most springs, not to inspect anymore, just to ask what's new in the rows. Caspioli keeps 3 of his own jars now, buried behind his own smokehouse, and doesn't laugh about it to anyone. Ottilie Marchbanks is buried in the Sourwood Gap churchyard these days, but her garden is still planted every spring from seed that traces straight back to a coffee can, 12 jars that outlasted every doubt aimed at them, and grew a whole valley's worth of second chances.